Now I'd like to invite Mr. Matthias Mitman, the U.S. Consul General in Erbil, to give the opening remarks for the conference. Mr. Consul General.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to acknowledge some of our distinguished guests, Dr. Barham Saleh, Chairman of the Board of the American University of Iraq Soleimani, Dr. Esther Molnix, President of the University, Dr. Armand Rahim, Chief of Staff to the Kurdish Regional Government Council of Ministers, Kurdish Regional Government Finance Minister Rabaz, and Dr. Thamer Gadban, Advisor to the Prime Minister of Iraq, Mr. Abadi. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I also want to thank Dr. Wahab and the American University of Iraq Soleimani for organizing today's event, as well as for all of the distinguished speakers, panelists, and everyone else attending this conference today. I especially want to thank those students of the university who are taking advantage of their studies here to participate in this conference. I want to also thank the Kurdish Regional Government Deputy Prime Minister Kakubad Talabani, who unfortunately could not be here today. Dr. Armanj delivered his speech, and I couldn't agree more with Kakubad that economic strength will be the ultimate source of long-term peace, prosperity, and stability for the people of this region. There is no topic more important to the future of the Iraqi Kurdistan region today, and no existential threat to the region more serious than the current economic financial crisis. I am encouraged by the stand taken by Prime Minister Nechavan Barzani and the Deputy Prime Minister Kakubad Talabani in their openness and acknowledgement of the need to implement tough reforms. And I'm also pleased to hear from Dr. Armanj that yesterday the Council of Ministers has taken initial steps, including creation of a board to oversee oil revenues in an effort to improve transparency. We applaud these steps and want to see more like them. I'm going to dispense with the usual diplomatic niceties and speak frankly on three major points. The first point that I want to address is that the people living in this region, regardless of their religion, politics, or ethnicity, must put aside their differences and face this crisis united. Unity and decisive leadership will be the key to survival in getting through this crisis. Secondly, economic reforms are essential. As Minister Rabaz said, there has to be the political will to make economic reforms. Taking economic reforms isn't easy. It won't be pleasant, and people will be called upon to make significant sacrifices. But generally, people are willing to make sacrifices if in doing so, they see it as contributing towards a brighter future for themselves and their children. The only way to make reforms palatable is to be open and honest with a clear view to the future. And I'll talk more specifically about reforms in a minute. Finally, I think it's important to emphasize that Iraq's Kurdistan region will be better equipped to weather this storm and build a more secure and prosperous future by improving relations with Baghdad. The first point is unity and leadership is key. Almost every man, woman, and child in the Kurdistan region is being affected by this crisis already, some more gravely than others. The Kurdish people are no strangers to hardship, and certainly there have been worse times, but unfortunately the pain of this crisis is only beginning. It likely will get worse before it gets better, but how much worse depends on you, on the decisions and actions that you take in your government. I'm not just talking about the government or the political leaders, although they have an important role. I'm talking about everyone in this room. Everyone in this room has a role. You come into contact with other people, with your families, your religious leaders, civil society organizers, academics, and youth. Everyone needs to become a more energetic advocate for economic reform. Crisis is the true test of a person, a leader, and a people. The Kurds have shown time and time again the ability to pull together in the face of an existential threat. This will be one of those times. If you are willing to put aside your differences and unite, if you are willing to make short-term sacrifices for long-term gain, I am confident you will come through this a stronger and more prosperous region. Second point, economic reforms are essential and they're urgent. When your income isn't sufficient to pay for your essential expenses, doing nothing is not an option. This is as true for governments as it is for a household. The Kurdish regional government no longer has the luxury of studying the situation and planning the best way to go about it. Again, as Minister Rabaz said, you need to have the political will now to implement economic reforms. What are some of these reforms? The first one is payroll reform. Most government salaries are already about 4 months in arrears, and current revenue, given current world oil prices, is only about half the amount needed to pay government payroll, pensions, and benefits. Again, doing nothing is not an option. By not taking action to reform the payroll, by not removing ghost workers and party workers, and not rationalizing salaries and reducing allowances, what are you doing? The KRG, by not taking these reforms, they're effectively cutting the wages of essential personnel such as Peshmerga, teachers, and healthcare workers. This is not sustainable. Essential government services cannot be maintained if essential government workers are not paid. It's that simple. The Kurdish regional government probably does not need 700,000 permanent employees on the payroll to do the government's work. There are many ways to reduce this burden. Combine some ministries, eliminate some, rationalize salaries, eliminate or reduce allowances, or in the case of the United States, when we have financial difficulties and the Congress fails to pass a budget, they furlough all but non-essential employees. They freeze salary increases. They freeze hiring. We've gone through these austerity programs in situations when the economic challenges facing us was much less than is currently facing the Kurdistan region and Iraq. But reforming payroll must be done in a fair and transparent manner that will ensure the continuation of basic government services. If you don't do it, and soon, the damage will only get worse. At the same time, it is important to provide a social safety net for society's most vulnerable, those most affected and least able to survive without a paycheck. You will need to revitalize and incentivize the private sector in an effort to transition workers who are currently on the government payrolls and moving them to jobs in the private sector where they will earn paychecks and contribute into the private sector. The next point, transparency. Studies show that civil unrest is most likely to occur when economic times are tough and the citizens do not trust their institutions. The KRG must restore trust in the government by providing full transparency and disclosure of all government revenues and expenses, especially with regard to oil revenue. Again, as Dr. Amanj noted, the Council of Ministers made a decision yesterday in Erbil to create a board that will start this process of improving transparency. We applaud that. According to the popular narrative, unfortunately, some people believe that the region's wealth is going into the pockets of the elite and not benefiting all Kurdistan residents. The only way to effectively counter this narrative is with full transparency and accountability. Again, improving transparency ultimately has to be a critical component of good governance and efforts to combat corruption. What are some other reforms? As Dr. Amanj indicated, and as other speakers have noted, it's also important to diversify the economy and not make it based solely on oil exports. You need to find ways to reform, to create incentives in the private sector that will strengthen agriculture, industry, tourism, and other sectors so that these become engines of growth and create employment and income for the Kurdistan region. I heard Dr. Amanj, when he was reading Dr. Talabani's speech, talk about the need to reform the electricity sector, converting power plants from diesel to natural gas, and reducing losses from transmission and theft. These are all much needed reforms, and we encourage the Kurdistan Regional Government to take them forward quickly. Clearly, there are some areas that the government knows what they need to do, and they are on the right track. We encourage them to move forward as quickly as possible. A few cautionary notes, however. It might be tempting to make reforms that will ultimately hurt rather than help. For instance, it might seem logical to impose import tariffs or to give local producers a price advantage over foreign competition to encourage agriculture. But policies like these, protectionist policies, ultimately hurt consumers, raise prices, and ultimately slow economic development. By background, I'm an economist. As many of you know, I used to teach economics before I became a diplomat. So I would like to just make a few academic comments about market economies. Ann Kruger, a former economist at the World Bank, conducted research on several economies that adopted protectionist policies, like tariffs and import bans, but then later discarded them. Kruger found that when governments like South Korea, Brazil, and Colombia removed barriers to trade, economic miracles happened. What she found, as have other economists who've examined the problem, was simple. Countries that freely admit imports consistently outperform those that keep them out with trade barriers. Price controls may also be a temptation, especially when money is scarce and people can't afford to buy goods in the market. You don't need to be an economist to understand that producers will produce less and consumers will consume more when the cost of something is kept artificially low. Price controls inevitably lead to shortages and to black markets, and subsidies have much the same effect. Because the KRG subsidizes electricity, demand exceeds supply. The KRG pays roughly 12 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity and collects about 2 cents in revenue for every kilowatt hour sold. This shortage is filled to some extent by high-priced diesel generators, but these subsidies cost the government an additional, again the Kurdish regional government, an additional $3 billion annually. Consumers also pay for high-priced supplemental power for the neighborhood generator operator, and still there is a shortage. The most successful economies are those that rely on market forces and open and fair competition. There is a place for government intervention, for instance, to streamline licensing, provide sensible regulations of public utilities to prevent fraud and abuses, and protect worker and public safety. But in general, economies grow faster when governments stay out of business and facilitate greater reliance on free market mechanisms in the private sector. Free prices, and free markets tend to produce greater rates of economic growth. What's the long-term strategy for the Kurdistan region? The Iraq's Kurdistan region is both blessed and cursed with abundant natural resources. One of the unfortunate aspects of a rentier economy is that people develop a culture of entitlement. They feel they don't have to produce anything because they are entitled to a share of their country's wealth by birthright. Each person is fighting for a bigger share of the same pie rather than making the pie bigger or creating another pie altogether. Sometimes this is referred to as a resource curse or Dutch disease. But the story has played out in the past in other countries, for example, Nigeria and Angola. But on the other hand, there's Norway, a country of roughly the same population as the Kurdistan region, about 5 million people. Norway was not immune to Dutch disease. For about 4 years after they discovered oil, they had Dutch disease, and it wreaked havoc on the Norwegian economy. But Norway found a cure by creating an oil trust and using that money to diversify its economy. Today, its 5 million inhabitants enjoy one of Europe's highest standards of living, despite the collapse of oil prices. Iraq's Kurdistan regions today stands at a crossroads. It can go the way of Nigeria and Angola, or it can go the way of Norway. The decisions that your government and that you will make as business leaders, political leaders, citizen activists will help decide which way the Iraq Kurdistan region goes. The last major point I want to make is the need to improve relations with Baghdad. I want to encourage Iraq's Kurdish region to strengthen its ties with Baghdad. The Kurdistan region cannot change its geographical location. It will always have neighbors like Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and as long as it has neighbors, it's important to maintain good relations with all its neighbors, but especially the neighbor to the south, with Baghdad, Iraq. Baghdad currently is also suffering from some of the same problems that affect the Iraq-Kurdistan region. Low oil prices, the war with Daesh, have severely damaged its economy as well. But both Erbil and Baghdad could benefit by uniting and combating these challenges together. In the past, this relationship between Baghdad and Erbil has been seen as a zero-sum game. That is, each side can only gain if the other side loses. But that's not the case. It's not the case that if the Iraq-Kurdish region wins, Baghdad loses, and vice versa. The whole can be greater than the parts. It can be a positive-sum game. I believe that if there's greater cooperation between Baghdad and Erbil, it's a positive-sum game. Both sides can benefit. And that's what I would encourage to see: greater contact, greater improved relations between Erbil and Baghdad to find creative solutions and common ground under a new paradigm. In closing, I would like to emphasize that while this is a difficult time, it is also an important transformative time for Iraq's Kurdistan region. In every crisis, there's also an opportunity. I hope that you use this opportunity to work together and to bring about the necessary reforms that will generate growth and prosperity for years to come. The United States has a strategic interest in a strong and prosperous Kurdistan region and Iraq. This is your opportunity to break the rentier mentality and transform this region into a shining example of what cooperation, hard work, and perseverance can accomplish. The United States and Iraq and the Kurdistan region have common strategic objectives currently on the security front. We want to see Daesh defeated. We want to see terrorists driven out of the Kurdistan region, out of Iraq. By working together, by tackling these economic and financial challenges, the United States can help contribute to a stronger, more prosperous, democratic partner here in the Middle East, and that's what our objective is. Thank you very much.